Good evening. My name is Alena Shautsova. I'm an immigration attorney from Brooklyn, New York, and today we continue our legally speaking seminars. Today's one is dedicated to what to expect at a USCIS interview. USCIS is a branch of government reserves the right to call for an interview an applicant for adjustment of status, an applicant for naturalization, an applicant for an asylum, withholding of removal. That's an affirmative asylum process. Sometimes USCIS may call an applicant in connection with other filings, for example, I-751 form or removal of condition on permanent residency. So what to expect? First of all, you have to expect that the officer would like to see the originals of the documents that you submitted. It might not be always that the officer is going to start his or her interview by asking you to produce the originals, but you need to expect to have those originals and to produce them. They have to be available. If they're not available for some reason, you need to consult with your attorney, or you need to review the guidelines, USCIS guidelines, what to do if, let's say, the original of your birth certificate is not available, what documents to substitute the original you can produce. You need to expect that the officer is going to ask you questions about eligibility for the benefits you are applying. If it's an interview because of the adjustment of status based on marriage to a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, you need to expect that the questions are going to focus on your marriage. If you in fact live with your spouse, what do you know about your spouse? Are you sharing common assets? Do you have joint accounts? What do you know about your spouse's work and things like that, job, things like that. So you need to get prepared. Even if you lived with the person for a while, you still need to review the forms that you submitted to make sure that you will provide accurate answers, because sometimes in a regular life we can forget our spouse's birthday, or we can forget the date of our anniversary. Not when you go for an immigration interview. There you are expected to remember things like that. If you are going for an interview based on because you filed for naturalization, you need to expect that during the first portion of the interview, the officer is going to administrate an English language test. An officer is going to ask you to write a sentence in English. An officer is going to ask you to read a sentence in English. And then the officer is going to ask you questions related to the United States history. Only if you file for a waiver based on some medical condition that is not allowing you to learn English, and that requirement has to be waived for you, then the officer is going to be conducting interview in your language using an interpreter. Otherwise, the interview is going to be in English. Mind that if the interview is for adjustment of status, you are allowed to have an interpreter there. Even if the notice in New York states that you need to bring an interpreter with you, in New York you do not bring an interpreter with you for adjustment of status interview. The government is going to give you a free one. But the government is not going to give you a free interpreter for an asylum interview. That's the interview that you bring your own interpreter with you. At least that's how it is in New York. I've heard that in some states you are allowed to bring an interpreter who is not a government provided interpreter for an adjustment of status interview. Now, sometimes there are legal and factual issues that the officer would like to resolve during the interview. Sometimes it's an issues of credibility. Most of the times, those are the issues of credibility that the officer would like to resolve. That's why you were called for an interview. But very often it's just a routine interview, like for adjustment of status based on marriage. Probably in 100% of cases, if the person did not come as a fiancé, a couple is going to be called for an interview. there are some forms and applications when you will not be called for an interview. So do not be surprised that those forms are adjudicated on paper. And that's very important to know this, because sometimes the person says, well, I will not put an affidavit in explaining this or that. I will just wait for my interview and I'm going to bring some documents with me. But sometimes you don't have this opportunity. For example, Form I-360, self-petition. If you file it without an application for adjustment of status, you will not be called for an interview. The officer may send you a request for more evidence if the officer would like to clarify certain things, but if you fail to respond to it, or if you do not bother to provide a detailed response to the request for more evidence, hoping that you will have an opportunity to explain yourself during the interview, do not hope for that, because there will not be an interview for I-360 form. The same goes for I-765, employment authorization form, or I-131, an advance parole. Now, there are situations when you can be called for, they called it an interview or an appointment in connection with I-131 form. It's parole in place. Then if you file for parole in place and application is going to be approved, then you will be called for an interview. So do not worry if after filing I-131 form for asking for parole in place, you were called for an interview. This is a good sign, because if the government would like to deny your parole in place application, they will just issue a decision, a denial, without calling you for an interview. This being said, what do you need to do to prepare for your interview? Well, first of all, review the notice. Make sure that you're going to comply with the notice. You know the address where you need to be. Verify how long it's going to take you to get there, so you are on time. The USCIS offices are very busy. They do not like people. They do not like, not people, but they do not like when you are late. Okay? It doesn't necessarily mean that your case is going to be denied, but the officer probably going to tell you to stay till the rest of the day and be the last one to come for an interview, because the officer has to ask and meet with those people who came on time. So do not be late. When you're reviewing the notice, make sure that you're going to have with you the documents that are specified in the notice, unless you already provided them to the government. Sometimes you provided the copies. Make sure then you bring the originals, as I said, because very often interview starts with the officer stating, may I see your birth certificate? May I see your original marriage certificate? And they just would like to take a quick look. They're not going to keep your originals. They just want to make sure that the copies are in fact of the original documents and not some forged documents. If you have troubles, as I said before, with some of the originals, you have to resolve this issue, or at least know what to say to your sales officer if he asks for an original that you do not have. Different offices have different manners in which they ask you questions. Some of them are aggressive and very serious. Some of them are very laid back and like to joke. It, it, it generally doesn't really matter what the manner of the officer, as long as you provide truthful and complete answers to the questions. I would tell my clients, usually don't joke too much with the officer, because they don't have a sense of humor, and or they presume not to have one, so they expect you to tell the truth. So if you're joking and you say something that's how it was a joke, the officer may take it a different way. So you have to be serious and answer truthfully and accurately to all the questions. Perhaps the hardest part of the interview and the process for a common person is to stay calm and focus on the question, and not to be stressed out to the point when you don't understand what the question is. And that's where work and preparation with your lawyer comes in. Lawyer is supposed to prepare you, telling you what questions to anticipate. The lawyer cannot coach you how to answer those questions, but the lawyer can help you so you are prepared as to what to expect. And it can be anything, truly. Sometimes the officer is in a bad mood. I had a couple situations when the officer was very aggressive towards me and my client at the beginning, and then he apologized that he had a bad day. He wasn't in any way concerning our case. So, but the client has to be prepared for that, because they do not understand sometimes that the the interviewing officers are just people, like regular people, and they may have their own problems, and they come to work just as we come to our work, and that sometimes it brings those problems with them, and that's understand. It's just like any one of us. So you have to be prepared to react calmly to anything that may come your way. It is very important. I will not talk here today about asylum interview or Stokes interview, because those are separate types of interview for very specific cases. I believe I have a short video on my website about asylum interview, and I have a lot of materials on my website about asylum. Stokes interview is a very different interview. If during the first interview for adjustment of status based on marriage, you and your spouse are going to be in the same room, and you will be asked relatively simple questions like what's your spouse's date of birth, or where did you guys meet, or who proposed to whom. During the Stokes interview, you will be asked very detailed questions about your marriage and your life with your spouse. That's the interview when they ask you about the color of your toothbrush. So it will be a very good idea to prepare for that interview with a lawyer, because if you fail that second interview, usually the consequences of that is that you cannot apply for any immigration benefit in the United States ever. Because if you fail that Stokes interview, the immigration is going to charge you with immigration fraud in connection with the marriage to a citizen, or citizen usually. So it's a very good idea to prepare with a lawyer. What happens if you need to postpone your interview? Well, you have to postpone, you have to postpone. It's usually a very simple procedure. If you have a lawyer in New York, a lawyer can use email inquiry and postpone your case via email. And the lawyer has to receive a confirmation that the case was postponed, to advise you not to show up for an interview. Now, if the email did not come in, the lawyer will have to go and talk to the USCIS people and tell them that we requested and present proof that you requested the interview to be postponed, but for whatever reason, the confirmation did not come. Usually, the instructions as to how to postpone an interview are at the bottom of the notice for interview. So you don't need to be worried about postponing the interview. It's not the end of the world. Sometimes actually it's a good idea, especially if there are some legal consequences of certain dates and how the case is adjudicated. So you need to really discuss it with your lawyer, or at least do some research online. Rarely a decision is made about an application at the time of the interview, meaning that you will receive a decision. The officer is probably going to have a good idea and even tell you if she is inclined to deny or grant your application. But recently, at least in New York, very often the officer would tell you, well, you have to expect the decision by mail in 90 or 120 days, depending on the type of the application. So that's okay. You don't need to be worried. Often the decision is going to come much sooner, but the officer would like to give herself more time to make a decision in case she discovers that there are some issues. So I hope that a little video clarified a little bit the mystery of the USCIS interview. And as always, you can find more information on my website, www.shautsova.com. Thank you.